Page number 455 of this Ramayana book, and this is a chapter number 30. The Yagna at Nikumbhila. And who's doing this Yagna? Indrajit, Ravan's son. Indrajit believed in the power of Yagna as much as he did in his own valor. He went directly to a tapovan called Nikumbhila. In that sacred grove, he kindled another fire. He sat before it, his body bare and his demons around him. He fed the fire with ghee that had been purified with mantras. Like a fierce priest, he was absorbed in his sacrifice, aflame himself, and his ritual precise and flawless. He offered Haviz, and the Agni blazed like a fragment of the sun. Meanwhile, back on the battlefield, Ram heard the outcry from Hanuman's warriors. He sent Jamvan and another force of monkeys to the son of the wind. The battle around the western gate had been abandoned, and Hanuman had just turned back when Jamvan came lumbering up to him. Jamvan saw tears streaming down the Vaner's face. Barely pausing to greet the rickshaw, Hanuman said, I must see Ram. The last Rakshas had fled into the city, and the massive gates clanged shut behind them. Hanuman came with Jamvan to where Ram and Sugriv sat. Bracing himself, the Vanar wiped his eyes and said as bravely as he could, There is terrible news, my lords. Then he looked into Ram's face and could not go on. Sugriv cried, What is it? What is your news, Hanuman? Choking, Hanuman said, Indrajit brought Sita to the field in his chariot. Before my eyes, he killed her with his sword. Ram collapsed as if he had been cut down with an axe. The Vanars rushed to him. They sprinkled water on his face while Lakshmana held his brother's head in his lap. The dazed Lakshmana whispered, Dharam is of no use in this world. My brother has been a savior to the Munis of the forests. He killed thousands of Rakshasas so that holy ones could live in peace, but his Dharam has not saved him from evil. And that monster Ravan still lives in his palace. Lakshman's handsome features twitched in a dark rictus. He cried, Gentleness and dharam are of no use in this world. But I swear Ravan will not live another day, and his city will be ashes when I have finished with it. Ram, rouse yourself. The hour of revenge is upon us. Sita may be dead, but Ravan will not escape with his life. Ram lay unmoving. Then Vibhishan came up to them. When he saw Ram unconscious, he wanted to know what had happened. Lakshman sobbed. Indrajit murdered Sita on the battlefield. Looking doubtful, Vibhishan asked, Who brought this news? Hanuman. Still, the good Rakshas was unperturbed. I know how much Ravan loves Sita. He would never let her be killed. But then he grew thoughtful. The Vanars and Lakshman hung on his every word and now on his silence. Suddenly Vibhishan gave a cry. Rouse yourself, monkeys, hurry. We must fly to Nikumbhila. In Indrajit created a Maya Sita and killed her on the field to shock you. As you grieve over a death that has never been, my spies have brought word that Indrajit has lit a fire at Nikumbhila. At this moment, he sits at a yagya that will make him invincible. We must stop him or the war is lost. Ram's eyes fluttered open. He asked for water. He sat up and sobbed when he remembered Hanuman's news. But Vibhishan said, Sita is not dead. Indrajit made a Maya Sita and killed her so he could gain time for his yagya. Ravan loves Sita too much to let a hair of her head be harmed. Indrajit would die if he dared touch her. Ram smiled wanly. Vibhishan hurried on. There is not a moment to lose. Indrajit already has Brahma's Astra and the horses the Pitamaha gave him. If he completes the yagya at Nikumbhila, he will have invincibility as well. Then not you, Ram, or Lakshman will be able to kill him, and everything will be lost. Give me an army of Vanars. Lakshman, come with me. Indrajit is the key to this war. Only he stands between us and victory. He must die, and my heart insists that Lakshman will be the one to kill him. Ram said quietly, Lakshman, go with Bhishan. Kill Indrajit and bring us victory. My brother, this is the battle you have prepared for all your life. But be careful. Remember, your enemy is a master of Maya. Go with my blessing, sweet prince. Your triumph at Nikumbhila will win this war for us. Next chapter, ambush. Lakshman picked up his bow. He put on his armor and took the padhuli from Ram's feet. His moment of destiny had arrived. He said, Bless me, Ram, who are my brother and my God. Let my arrows drink Indrajit's blood. Ram laid his palm on his brother's head. Lakshman embraced him tenderly. Then he followed Vibhishan and the Vanars toward Nikumbhila. Jamvan went with them, with 100 great bears who had crossed the ocean into Lanka. Swiftly, stealthily, they arrived in Nikumbhila. They heard the yagya fire crackling. They heard Indrajit chanting mantras of power. All else was silence. Vibhishan said, We must attack them before it is too late. The Vanars must take the Rakshasas unawares. When Indrajit comes out in anger, let him find Lakshman waiting for him. Rising out of the jungle around the yagya, armed with rocks and trees, the monkeys attacked Indrajit's demons. Savagely came the Vanars, and in a moment 100 Rakshasas lay dead, their heads crushed with the wild weapons. The demons seized up their swords and fought back, and the Yagyashala turned into a battlefield. Blood splashed everywhere, hewn off limbs flew at bizarre trajectories, and Indrajit's solemn chanting was drowned by the roars of monkey and demon. More deafening than these were the roars of Jamvan's bears, who flew at the Rakshasas in a black storm. Their fangs and claws were death's lightning. His sacrifice ruined, Indrajit jumped up with a cry. Red-eyed, he stalked out from the Yagyashala, and that prince was terrible, even to look at. Vibhishan said to Lakshman, He is beside himself with anger. You have the advantage. Hanuman, who had come along for the battle, had grown huge again. He pulled up a knotty tree for his weapon and battered the Rakshasas to a pulp before they could run from him. Growling to see the son of the wind, Indrajit sprang at him, but that Lakshman pulled on his bowstring. He stood behind the great old Nayograd tree under which the Yagya fire still burned. Neglected, the forest echoed with that sound. Turning away from Hanuman with a snarl, Indrajit faced Lakshman. Vibhishan stood beside the Kshatriya. Indrajit realized at once who had brought the Vanars to this secret place. Choking with rage, he hissed, Traitor, you have eaten the salt of Lanka all your life, and you shall be damned forever. No Rakshas child will ever say your name except as a curse. You have betrayed your brother and your nephew. How could you, coward? You are Ram's slave, but remember, Vibhishan, you are dealing with the enemy. Once his use for you is over, he will not spare your life. He will kill you like the cur you are. Vibhishan cried. You are the evil spawn of an evil father. Ravan had every chance to save himself and his people, but he would not walk the way of Dharma. You may be a great warrior, but you have no wisdom, only arrogance. It is true I was born a Rakshas, but I never loved violence as the rest of you do. And though he is a great warrior than you or your father, Ram shuns violence whenever he can. He knows the way of violence is not the way of dharma. The wise have always said that to lust after another man's wife is madness. It is the sin that ruins a man. But Ravan has always reveled in sin, making a life of it, whether murdering rishis for his sport or reviling the devas who are the guardians of the earth. But now the time has come to pay. Neither your father nor you will escape. Look, Indrajit, Lakshman guards the Nayogrit tree where your Agni burns. Not you, but he. Dare you approach it? Dare you tempt your death? For the first time in his wild and heroic life, Indrajit felt a cold pang of fear. Indrajit and Lakshman. Hissing like an angry cobra, Indrajit mounted his chariot. Hanuman appeared at Lakshman's side and lightly lifted the Kshatriya onto his shoulders. The horses Brahma had given Indrajit shone like silver in the mid morning sun. The Rakshas cried, "Foolish mortal, have you forgotten how you and your brother twice lay in a swoon of death? No one can save you from me 3 times." But Lakshman was calm. Now this moment of fate was upon him. He said quietly, "Brave words and brave deeds are not the same thing. Besides, each time you came to battle, you came invisibly. Only cowards fight like that because they are afraid of their enemy and afraid to die. Let me see your valor now that we are face to face." Before he had finished speaking, Indrajit shot a clutch of searing arrows at him. They covered his fair body in a blossoming of blood. With a cry, Lakshmana loosed 5 narcas at the Rakshas. They stung Indrajit and he roared, but they did not wound him gravely. On they fought, the prince of Lanka and the prince of Ayodhya. Both were quick as light, both were masters of archery, like two lions for the lordship of a jungle. They battled. Soon asters flared from their bows and lit up the hillside as if other suns had risen into the day. Arrows stuck in each one's body and blood flowed richly from their wounds. They fought on, unmindful, upon the edge of death. The forest was hushed at the sound of their bowstrings, and all the Rakshasas, Vanars, and Rikshas around them grew still, as if they realized how pointless their lesser contentions were. They stood gazing at the mythic duel, and it seemed primeval phalanxes fought from the two princes' bodies, timeless legions of darkness and light. A hum of subtle shafts from Lakshman's magic quiver clipped the joints of Indrajit's armor. Like a snake's skin, the light silver mail fell away from the demon prince's body. Crouching beard, Indrajit shot 20 arrows in a blur, not only at Lakshman, but now at Vibhishan as well. Taken unawares, Vibhishan was struck down. He bore no arms against his nephew, but he recovered quickly and plucked the barbs from him. Yet his cry of pain distracted Lakshman for a moment. In a flash, Indrajit shot his armor away also, and he was as unprotected as his adversary. By now, Vibhishan had joined the fray. He killed 100 Rakshasas, but not an arrow did he shoot at his brother's son. Blind and deaf to everything around them, save each other and their missiles, Lakshman and Indrajit fought on. War was their art. They were masters, absorbed in their arcane craft. Both were so far above any other warrior there that only the princes themselves, one of grace and the other of evil, fathomed the dimensions of the duel. This was a trial of superior wills, a contention of two great spirits to the death of one. The wind did not stir when Indrajit and Lakshman duelled at Nikumbhila. The birds and beasts of the forest were hushed. Slowly, an unnatural twilight fell on that place. Because the very sky was veiled with arrows, they loosed their shafts with the swiftness of inspiration, and both warriors were hardly visible for their speed. Indrajit fought from the air and the ground, and when he flew up, Hanuman rose with him. Finally, the demon saw that fighting from the sky was no advantage to him. The son of the wind was quicker through the air than his magic horses. Not merely that forest or island, but all the earth held its breath when these princes fought. In the deepest jungles and on the most exalted faraway mountains, fires of sacrifice flickered and died down when Indrajit and Lakshman duelled on Lanka. Then, as if with strength and will he had saved for this moment, Lakshman struck Indrajit's horses with 8 scorching arrows, so they whinnied in agony and blood spurted from their flanks. As those fine steeds faltered for a moment, Lakshman killed Indrajit's charioteer with another shaft through his heart. With a curse, Indrajit leaped onto the chariot head. Thrusting his dead Sarathi out of the way, he seized the fallen reins and drove the silver horses himself, while in the same hand that gripped the reins, he held his bow and covered Lakshman with fire. But now Ravan's son's prowess was constrained, and the Vanars jumped onto his horse's back. Indrajit could not hold them off while he fought Lakshman and drove the chariot at once. With fangs, nails, mighty sinews, and rocks, the monkeys killed Indrajit's horses. Night fell on the jungle. No one saw where Indrajit melted into it and vanished back to the city of Lanka. Lakshman killed 1,000 Rakshasas, while his eyes always sought their prince. His ire was risen now. Indrajit and he had battled at the ends of their genius. It was a tide in him. The spirit of that elegant and mortal duel, and Lakshman could hardly contain it. Fortunately for his Rakshasas, Indrajit travelled on a wizard's feet to Lanka. He did not tarry there for even a moment. No one saw him come or go. He mounted another chariot, fleet as the one the monkeys had destroyed. It was yoked to horses as marvelous as those that had died. Brahma had given him a whole stable of them. Like Yam's wrath, the Rakshas flew back into the battle. In fury at what they had done to his horses, he fell wildly on the monkeys. He killed countless Vanars before Lakshman stood before him again and drew his fire. Fortune smiled on Lakshman for an instant, and he broke Indrajit's bow in his hands. But quick as fear, Indrajit picked up another bow and loosed a sizzle of arrows at Vibhishan and Hanuman. Having exhausted the lesser astras, having gouged at each other, the two archers now summoned more powerful weapons. Indrajit invoked a pale shaft of death, a Yamastra, and shot it at Lakshman. But Lakshman cut it down with an artful weapon of the mountain Yakshas, great Kuber's Astra. Joined in a momentous flame, the two Ayuds plunged into the sea to be extinguished in the deep after hours. Lakshman invoked the Varunastra of cold and watery death, but Indrajit met it with a fiery Rodra. Screaming in the sky, the two put each other out and fell in grey ashes to the earth. Lakshman loosed the Agni-astra of 1,000 flames, but his enemy's Khalid, Surya-astra, erupted against it. Fire consumed fire on high, and both subsided. Indrajit fitted an Asurastra to his bowstring, a demonical weapon and close to his heart. It was the astra of his race, but Lakshman met it with a Maheshwastra as it came keening at him and smashed it into shards of darkness. It was each other's knowledge as much as each other's strength and quickness that the two warriors plumbed their gyan of the Devastras. For every Suryastra would not put out every Agnyastra, nor would all Maheshwastras cut down any Asura. Myriad were the astras and infinite their variety. Only the greatest archers, who had been instructed in their lore by the most knowing gurus, could match one another missile for missile as Lakshman and Indrajit did. Only those blessed by the guardians of the occult weapons could survive a duel like this one for as long as these princes did. Unseen in the ethereal Akash, the fifth element, the rishis and the pithers gathered in the sky and poured down their blessings in subtle waves to Lakshman, who fought like a lion below them. He heard a voice in his heart whispering urgently to him, "The moment of his death has come. Summon the Astra of the king of the Devas. Kill him with Indra's weapon." Lakshman invoked the Indrastra, reluctant Ayudh, relucent Ayudh. He whispered a fierce prayer. "If it is the true Ram, has been strayed from Dharam, let this arrow have Indrajit's life in my brother's name. Clearing the darkness, lightening the faces of the ancestors and the sages with unearthly luster, the astra flared from Lakshman's bow, and Indrajit had no answer to it. It took him his lean head from his neck in a scarlet flash, and his scream echoed through the shocked forest. When the light of the astra faded, the severed head lay on the red earth of Lanka like a golden lotus sprouted from the soil. The Vanars, triumphant, roaring, shook Ravan's palace and fell on Ram's ears across the mountain. Like the sun fallen to the earth, Indrajit's head lay glowing in death. A star burned down. His pale body lay apart, like the moon cursed by Daksh to wane forever. Wailing, the Rakshasas fled back to Ravan on his lonely throne to tell him his last hope had been dashed. Once Mandotri's brilliant son had brought Indra himself, bound in hoops of fire, to Lanka. He had paraded the lord of the Devas through the streets of his father's city. Today Indrajit lay dead, his head plucked from his body by Indra's astra. The next chapter is the hero. Lakshman stood drenched in blood. His bowstring still quivered from discharging the Indrastra that killed Indrajit. Petal rain fell out of the sky as if the Devas had crushed a rainbow and showered the pieces down on the Kshatriya. This was the most critical victory yet. Indrajit had been the key to this war, the only Rakshas who had seemed invincible. Joy coursed through heaven and earth, but Ravan was not yet dead. Glowing with his achievement, Lakshman came from Ram before Ram. When Vibhishan told him Indrajit was dead, Ram jumped up and cried to his brother, "Now are you a man?" Ram clasped Lakshman to him and kissed him repeatedly. He said, "This is the greatest triumph of our war. As long as Indrajit lived, victory was just a dream. Now it is within reach." Then his eyes filling to see Lakshman's wounds, Ram began to clean them himself like a mother. Though Lakshman blushed brightly, Ram would not let him move. "What you have done will break Ravan's heart. Indrajit was his last hope. Now Ravan is as good as dead." When Lakshman told him what Hanuman and Vibhishan had done, Ram hugged them also. He said, "It won't be long now. Ravan will come to fight me." Sushen arrived there. Ram handed Lakshman over to his care, for the younger prince was in pain. Hanuman and Vibhishan were wounded as well, and some Vanars and Rikshas. Patiently and gently, Sushen went to work on them all. Sushen was their Vanar doctor. Okay, the Vaidya. Soon their pain was eased, and their wound mouths were closed by his attentions. In those days, the healing herbs of the earth were truly effective. It is only in the Kali Yuga they have lost so much of their potency. Shaft by shaft, the duel between Lakshman and Indrajit was described to an avid Ram. Indrajit's courage and skill were praised, and the fact that he never used Maya while he fought. Man to man, they had battled. The better warrior prevailed, and the one whose death was written was vanquished. Vibhishan, who knew Ram, worried about Lakshman's quick temper, said how calm Lakshman had been on this, the great occasion, and that was what had given him victory, because Indrajit had fought with anger. Not once or twice, but 10 times Ram made them repeat each detail of the battle, as this was indeed music to his ears. 100 times he hugged Lakshman, making him blush in embarrassment and joy. The next chapter is Wrath. Ravan's ministers did not know how to break the news to their king. When they stood wordlessly before him, he fixed them in a glare and said, "Speak, what have you come to say?" "Lord, Indrajit fought Ram's brother at Nikumbhila. He made the human's body a home for his arrows. Lakshman was covered in his own blood. Your son fought Hanuman and Vibhishan. A slow smile appeared on Ravan's face. How did Lakshman die? But the ministers made no reply. Ravan cried, did Ram's brother escape with his life? That you stand so silent? Tell me. They said in a whisper, the duel was fierce and even, Lord, but at last Lakshman killed your son. Indrajit has been gathered to his fathers. For a moment was there such silence in that court you could hear the heartbeats of those who stood in it. Then a long wail burst from Ravan. Again and again he howled his son's name as if to call him back from the dead, until compassionate nature intervened and Ravan slumped from his throne in a faint. They let him lie for a while before they dared to fetch water and sprinkle his face with it. Crying his son's name, the Rakshas awoke from oblivion into a nightmare, the ruin that was his life. Indrajit, my little child, you have died before me. I thought you were invincible, or I would never have sent you into battle. You brought Indra bound with your serpent fire and marched him through our streets, and now a mere man has killed you? How could I have foreseen this, even in my dreams? Ravan groaned. His glorious life had become a living hell. Just one sin had brought him to this pass, one terrible error of judgment. Or perhaps it was the weight of all his other sins, his dark and arrogant past, that had finally pulled him down. In his time, he had truly borrowed more from life than he could afford to pay back. The last few days had turned Ravan's hair pure white. Softly he said, my son, to die in battle is the best kind of death. It is better than dying of old age in your bed, helpless and dependent on someone for every breath you draw. Those who die as heroic as a death as you did find heaven for themselves. You died fighting for your father, and you will have an exalted place in Swarg. Ravan smiled bitterly. Today, all the Devas, the Danavs and Daityas, the Gandharvas, Charans, Kinnars, and Kimpurush rejoice. Because Indrajit, whom none of them could face in battle, is dead. Devlok celebrates this day. Indra's cup of joy brims over. Ah, Meghnath, my cloud child, it seems just yesterday that you were a baby, and I cradled you in my arms. I feel this earth is an empty dream now that you are dead. And the only truth is the anguish in my heart. My son, my sweet son, how will I live without you? He wept like a child himself. How will I tell your mother you are dead? Will you be loved better in any heaven that you have chosen to leave us in Lanka, whose very life you were? Weren't you meant to offer tarpan for me when I died? To set the first flame to my pyre? But you have changed all that. You have made me the son by dying before me. Oh, my precious child, forgive me. I never thought my sin was so heinous that I would have to face this grief. Ravan wept as if it were as natural as breathing to him now. He spoke in a low voice to himself, though he did not care any more who heard him. No, not even she is worth this, but I could not help myself. Once I had seen her face. No, Indrajit, it's not a warrior's arrows, but a woman's beauty that killed you. As she is the most beautiful woman on earth, she is also the most dangerous. She is Lanka's nemesis. He sat sunk in his throne, hovering between grief and madness. But this his innate courage returned to him, and anger. The eyes flashed. Nine sinister heads glowered in their cluster around his central face. There was a wrath in those eyes that death itself would not put out. His ministers shrank from their king. His breath blazed even like Vritarasura's of old. Ravan whispered, she has brought me nothing but pain and misfortune. And for what? She did not return my love. She came into Lanka like a curse. For her sake, I have lost my brothers and my sons, my nephews, Parhasta, and a million devoted Rakshasas. They have all died for her, and she does not care even to look into my face. His chest heaved with feelings too powerful to think about or even contain. Ravan said, "She must die." He shouted it loud until the palace rang with his roaring. "She must die, she must die, Sita must die." The 9 fiendish heads bobbed up and down, chanting, "She must die. We told you she must die." His ministers had never heard those heads speak before. They shivered to listen to their loathsome chatter. Molten tears ran down all Ravan's faces. He drew his sword, blue and glinting, without another word. His main face set in a mask, he strode out from his sabha. Down the lofted corridors of his palace went Ravan, heading for the Ashok one. His steps rang along those passages, and his women and ministers followed him fearfully. Though they had seen his rage through the years, on and off the field of battle, never before they had seen their king like this. He was entirely demonic, a spirit of darkness. No one dared try to stop him. His sword, a streak of lightning in his hand, Ravan stalked towards Sita to kill her. It was as if his great love had turned into the darkest hatred. His ministers and some of his wives began to speak to the Rakshas, to beg him altogether not to commit the crime he seemed bent upon. Sita saw Ravan striding toward her. She sensed his wrath across the Ashokan. She saw the naked blade in his hand and knew her death was coming. Her life lurched in her, a thing of perfect fear. She thought desperately that he came to kill her because she spurned him. She thought Ram was dead. She wished she had allowed Hanuman to carry her out of Lanka. All this in the space of a moment. Ravan was deaf to the pleas of his women and his ministers. Grimly he strode toward Sita. When he was halfway across the Ashok one, she saw another figure dart out from a side door of the palace and run toward the demon. She did not know him, but this was Suparshva, one of the last of Ravan's trusted ministers left alive. Suparshva clutched his king's arm and cried with no thought for his own life, "My lord, what are you doing? Have you lost your mind that you even think of killing a woman?" Ravan stopped, and for a moment it seemed Suparshva's death had come. His king turned on him, snarling, and raised his sword, but as if he was compelled by fate herself, that Rakshas cried, "What use it turning your wrath on a helpless woman, and one you love besides? The war is not lost, and the greatest warrior is on our side. You, my lord, don't give in to despair. When have you ever lost a battle? Turn this rage on Ram, and victory shall still be yours." Suparshva saw he had his king's attention. Ravan growled horribly, but he lowered his sword. He blinked his eyes, and the cluster of 9 heads vanished from sight, as if he had mastered them once more and himself. Waking from madness, the Rakshas shook his head to clear it and grew attentive. He seemed to see the world around him again. He seemed to hear what Suparshva said. More, he seemed to doubt his own anger and to realize the sense of what his minister was saying. Frantic to convince his king, that Rakshas went on, "My lord, today is the 14th day after the full moon. Tomorrow is Amavasya, the night of the new moon. Fight Ram tomorrow, and you will surely kill him." Hope sparked alive again in Ravan's eyes and clutched at his wretched heart. From across the Ashok one, he saw Sita's face, and it shone like a bit of higher world fallen into this one. Seeing that face, Ravan knew he would not have been able to kill her anyway. When he was actually faced with the moment, he still loved her more than anything else. His sons' lives, his brothers, his people's, his own. Suparshva saw the yearning in his king's face and said gently, "My lord, when Ram is dead, she will be yours." Let's read one more chapter. Moolabala. With a last lingering look at the woman who had ruined him, Ravan thrust his sword back into its sheath and stalked back into his palace. In the little temple, Sita sobbed in relief. She had a clear sense of being saved, yet again, by forces beyond the ken of reason. Without knowing who he was, Sita blessed Suparshva with all her heart. In his sabha, Ravan paced the white marble floor from bay window to bay window, from the tall doors to his throne, feverishly. Often he had to wipe his eyes. The tears for Indrajit had not stopped flowing, yet the enemy was at his gate, and he must face him. At last he stopped his pacing. He went to his throne and sat in it, and a great decisiveness came over the Rakshas. After he turned back from the Ashokwan, he had not spoken a word to anyone. His ministers and commanders stood by, waiting for his command. Ravan rose again. He went to the Rakshasas, who were the leaders of his Moolbal. The elite guard was the root of his power. These were his best warriors. He said, "Take horses, chariots, elephants, and foot soldiers. The human has killed my son. I want his life." Every Rakshas in Ravan's Moolbal was a great warrior, and there were 100,000 of them. This was the force Ravan had saved until the end of the war. None of these demons had yet gone to fight. They were all masters of astras and had been taught by Ravan himself. The Moolbal was the scourge of the worlds, the bane of the Devas. Now the Rakshas unleashed it on Ram and the Vanars. Bristling with occult weapons, Ravan's crack legion went to war. The rocks and trees the Vanars hurled made no impression on that force. They smashed those weapons of earth and jungle with riptides of asters. These Rakshasas were unlike any others the Vanars had faced before. They fought like one man. As the monkeys perished in hundreds every moment, it seemed an army of Indrajits had come to slaughter them. The Vanars fled to Ram, crying they could not face the Moolbal. Already 20,000 monkeys' corpses lay strewn across the field, and not a single Rakshasa had fallen. Without a word, Ram stood up, dark and tremendous. He raised his bow, and next moment the prince of Ayodhya was a blur before his Vanars' eyes. Ram's archery against Ravan's Moolwal was like Shiva's Tandav. He was a cloud, and his arrows were the livid rain that lashed the Rakshasa legion. He was a sun, and his shafts were beams that lit the darkness of the Moolbal and iridescent death. In no time, 20,000 Rakshasas lay beside the Vanars they had slain. Ram's archery was unfathomable. It was transcendent, not of time, but of infinity. And of Ram himself, while he waged immaculate war, there was no physical sign save his bow. Bent in a circle of flames, the Kodand seemed to hang on air. No visible hand wielded it, but it consumed the Moolbal in its firestorm. Even as we, the deluded in this world of sansar, do not see the living Jivatma in ourselves, so too Vanar and Rakshas no longer saw Ram. But the death he brought was everywhere. Elephants fell, horses and chariots were shattered, and most of all, Rakshasas fell. Thousands of Ravan's best warriors. To asters that hung fire in the sky and fell on them with erupting hearts of flame, each one made of 1,000 deadly shafts. Not an arrow fell tamely. Every one claimed a demon's life. Time seemed to stand still, awestruck. The blue prince raised the battle into another, supernal dimension. The Rakshasas cried that he was invisible, so they could not shoot back at him. Ram loosed a subtle Gandharvastra at the Moolbal, and it came upon them like a fragrant breath of spring. But it was full of hallucinations and it mastered their minds. Suddenly, those Rakshasas saw 1,000 Rams. They saw him everywhere, smiling, his radiant bow calling them to death, which they knew was such a tender ceremony at his hands. Then again they did not see him, but only the luster of his arrows, a single ubiquitous light engulfing them. They no longer knew or cared when they died. The Rakshasas sighed and were all at strange peace. Many even died with Ram's sweet name on their lips. In just a Muhurat, all that legion was raised. Just a handful at the very rear of the Moolbal fled back to their master in his palace. It was a repetition of Panchvati, but the force of Rakshasas this time was much greater, and they were not merely forest demons who tormented rishis of the One. These were Ravan's finest troops, handpicked and trained by the king. In a short hour, the invincible Moolbal was annihilated. The widows of the dead streamed into the streets of Lanka, and their lament filled the city. Some cried, "All this is Shurpnakha's fault. She began this war." And others, "Ravan should have been warned when Khar was killed and the 14,000 at Janasthan. But he was smitten blind with the human woman. He does not care who is sacrificed. Lavan doesn't love his people anymore, only Sita. Kumbhakaran, Atike, and Indrajit died. Still, he sent our men to their deaths. Once the streets of Lanka were full of Veena Nadam, soft flute notes, women's voices singing, the tinkling little bells and anklets, and the moans and sighs of Rakshasas at love, all of which Hanuman heard when he first came. Now the same streets were riven with screaming and wailing, the gnashing of teeth and bitter accusations. There was not a house in that city which had not lost a son, a father, a brother, or a husband, slain for the sake of what the women saw as their king's madness. The handful of his Moolbal that escaped Ram came, shocked and bloody, before their sovereign. Ravan sat coiled, hissing like a king cobra on his throne. He bit his lip and trembled. Deep lines of anguish were etched on his ashen face. He had not dreamed his finest legion could vanish as it had, like snow in a desert. Now his body glowed with the fury in him like the pralya. He had already learned of the rout when the remnant of the 100,000 returned to him. He did not look at them, but whispered, "Let Mahaparshva, Virupaksha, and Mohodra come to me." When these Rakshasas came, Ravan had controlled himself. He said to them softly, but with intense purpose, "I am going to war. I will cover the sun and the moon, the sky and the earth with arrows. Let those who will, that remain alive, come with me. I do not command it, I, Ravan, ask it. I am going to avenge Kumbhakaran and Prahast, Atike, and Indrajit. With my own hands, I will wipe the tears of every woman in Lanka who weeps. I will avenge every Rakshas who had died for me. Tell them, not a Vanar shall live, not Ram or his brother, not Vibhishan, Hanuman, or Sugriv, or any of the others. Those of you who will march gladly with me, come." He strapped on his armor, light as mist. He strode out from his sabha and into the sun, where his chariot waited for him, with the piles of bows and arrows laid in it. Not a living Rakshas stayed behind in Lanka when Ravan went to battle. Every demon accompanied his king. Even the wounded went back to fight. For long ages he had brought them glory, and they would share death with him before they betrayed his trust. As soon as he came out into the sun, his anxiety and sorrow fell away like shreds of night. This was the hour of reckoning, and the Rakshas was a great warrior. He did not fear battle, he loved it. Only the waiting had been unendurable. Awesome Ravan stood up tall in his rath to wave to his last army. In one voice, his Rakshasas roared his name. Jai, they thundered. Jai Ravan. Let's stop it here and we'll see how the battle goes on with Ravan in the battlefield. Any question, comment? So if you don't have a question, let's look at the titles in the Hindi translation also. हनुमान जी के नेतृत्व में वानरों और निशाचरों का युद्ध, and निशाचर, so these rakshasas, they are called निशाचर. हनुमान जी का श्री राम के पास लौटना और इंद्रजीत का निकुंभला मंदिर में जाकर होम करना. श्री हवन, होम, यज्ञ, it's the same thing. सीता के मारे जाने की बात सुनकर श्री राम का शोक से मूर्छित होना और लक्ष्मण को उन्हें समझाते हुए पुरुषार्थ के लिए उद्यत होना. विभीषण का श्री राम को इंद्रजीत की माया का रहस्य बताकर सीता के जीवित होने का विश्वास दिलाना और लक्ष्मण को सेना सहित निकुंभला मंदिर में भेजने के लिए अनुरोध करना. विभीषण के अनुरोध से श्री रामचंद्र जी का लक्ष्मण को इंद्रजीत के वध के लिए जाने की आज्ञा देना और सेना सहित लक्ष्मण का निकुंभला मंदिर के पास पहुंचना. वानरों और राक्षसों का युद्ध. हनुमान जी के द्वारा राक्षस सेना का संहार और उनका इंद्रजीत को द्वंद्व युद्ध के लिए ललकारना तथा लक्ष्मण का उसे देखना. इंद्रजीत और विभीषण की रोषपूर्ण बातचीत. लक्ष्मण और इंद्रजीत की परस्पर रोष भरी बातचीत और घोर युद्ध. विभीषण का राक्षसों पर प्रहार, उनका वानर युद्धपतियों को प्रोत्साहन देना, लक्ष्मण द्वारा इंद्रजीत के सारथी का और वानरों द्वारा उसके घोड़ों का वध. इंद्रजीत और लक्ष्मण का भयंकर युद्ध तथा इंद्रजीत का वध. लक्ष्मण और विभीषण आदि का श्री रामचंद्र जी के पास आकर इंद्रजीत के वध का समाचार सुनाना, प्रसन्न हुए श्री राम के द्वारा लक्ष्मण को हृदय से लगाकर उनकी प्रशंसा तथा सुषेण द्वारा लक्ष्मण आदि की चिकित्सा. रावण का शोक तथा सुपार्श्व के समझाने से उसका सीता वध से निवृत्त होना. श्री राम द्वारा राक्षस सेना का संहार, राक्षसियों का विलाप. रावण का अपने मंत्रियों को बुलाकर शत्रुवध विषय का अपना उत्साह प्रकट करना और सबके साथ रणभूमि में आकर पराक्रम दिखाना. So this is how much we have covered in that English translation. So now if we have Padmini, if she can sing a bhajan for us, that will be wonderful. But if she is not there, then somebody else can sing.
Namaste, Hershi, I'm here.
Okay, all right, good, Padmini. So if you can sing a bhajan for us.
Sure.